June 22, 1944. 4 a.m. The Eastern Front. A deep silence hangs over the forests and rivers of Belarusia. The mist clings low, thick as breath on glass. The sun, not yet fully risen, casts long shadows through shattered tree limbs and the twisted wreckage of winter's war. Somewhere in the distance, the creak of a tank turret turning. A dog barks and is silenced. The birds do not sing. Inside forward Soviet trenches, men stand shoulder to shoulder. Faces grimy with mud and anticipation. Eyes fixed on the horizon. Cigarettes burn slowly between cracked fingers. One man quietly folds a letter into his tunic, never expecting to send it. Then the earth moves. A shockwave splits the morning stillness. Thousands of artillery barrels roar in unison, lighting up the skies like a firestorm summoned from the underworld. The Red Army's vengeance, months in the making, finally unleashed. Shells scream overhead toward German lines, tearing into bunkers, cratering command posts, uprooting forests, burying men and machines under tons of steel and fire. This is not another skirmish. It is a reckoning. By nightfall, entire German divisions will vanish. By July, Hitler's Eastern Front will collapse. The name of the storm is Operation Bagration. And it begins right now. 3 years earlier, Germany had seemed invincible. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa had hurled over 3 million Axis troops across the Soviet border. It was the largest land invasion in history, a juggernaut of tanks, planes, and ambition. Within months, German armies had pushed deep into Soviet territory. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and even the outskirts of Moscow had fallen or faced encirclement. Nazi Germany's military dominance seemed absolute. But what followed was not conquest. It was endurance. The Soviet Union bled but did not die. Winter came, and with it, the brutal Soviet counteroffensive of December 1941. The Wehrmacht reeled. Then came Stalingrad in 1942–43, a siege turned slaughter. In 1943, Kursk, the largest tank battle the world had ever seen, shattered any lingering myth of German superiority. Yet by early 1944, Hitler still clung to the dream of victory. Though the Red Army had pushed westward and reclaimed vast territories, the German Army Group Center held firm in Belarusia. A massive wedge of German strength still occupied Minsk, Vitebsk, and Orsha, fortified towns strung together by hardened defensive lines and deep logistical routes. The German High Command believed this sector unbreakable. Behind the front, life in the Reich ticked on. Propaganda flooded the airwaves, promising ultimate victory. Factories in Essen, Hamburg, and Berlin churned out tanks, shells, and dreams of retaliation. But cracks had begun to spread. The Allies had landed in Italy. British and American bombers now flew daily raids over the fatherland. And to the east, Stalin was watching, waiting, preparing. For nearly a year, Soviet High Command, the Stavka, had been orchestrating something vast and terrible. Their target, Army Group Center. Their aim, total annihilation. By the spring of 1944, the Red Army was not the same force that had been driven back in 1941. It was reformed, rearmed, and reorganized under seasoned commanders. Frontline units had fresh tanks, new artillery doctrines, and unprecedented logistical support. And most importantly, they had experience. They had seen what the Germans could do. And they had learned how to break them. But the Soviet leadership needed the right moment. That moment came in mid-1944. Germany was stretched thin. Hitler had diverted forces to defend France against a looming Allied invasion. Reinforcements and supplies were siphoned westward. Meanwhile, the center of the Eastern Front, Belarusia, remained overconfident, undersupported, and dangerously exposed. A plan was finalized. Its name, taken from a Tsarist-era general and national hero, Pyotr Bagration. Operation Bagration would become the most devastating single offensive launched by any army in World War II. But its genius lay not just in its scale, but in how completely it caught the German war machine by surprise. The collapse wasn't merely military. It was psychological, strategic, political. And once it began, it would never be reversed. To understand the success of Operation Bagration, one must first understand the blindness of the enemy. In the months leading up to June 1944, the German High Command had grown complacent. Having endured several Soviet offensives already, they had developed a dangerous assumption that Stalin would strike the south, Ukraine, where oil fields, critical rail lines, and existing momentum suggested a logical target. Hitler himself agreed. He ordered reinforcements to the southern front. Army Group South, already bruised, was bolstered. Army Group Center, meanwhile, was left to hold its line with minimal support, despite controlling a front nearly 600 miles wide. German intelligence, once feared for its precision, failed catastrophically. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, underestimated Soviet strength by more than 100%. They believed the Red Army had, at most, 150 divisions in the region. In reality, the Soviets had amassed over 2.3 million men. That failure was not accidental. Stalin's Stavka had mastered the art of maskirovka, strategic deception. Entire radio networks were faked. Dummy units were staged in Ukraine. False orders, troop movements, and forged documents painted a convincing picture. The main Soviet blow would fall in the south. German commanders, convinced by this illusion, shifted their reserves away from Belarusia. It was a deadly miscalculation. By early June, the Soviet buildup was complete. Over 5,000 tanks, 5,300 aircraft, and nearly 60,000 artillery pieces had been brought to bear. These were not hastily trained conscripts. Many were veterans of Stalingrad, Kursk, and the drive westward. Their commanders, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, and others, were hardened, strategic minds who understood the terrain and the enemy. The plan was brutally elegant. For Soviet fronts, equivalent to army groups, would launch a synchronized assault across 1,000 kilometers of front. Their goal was not just to punch through the lines. It was to encircle and destroy the entire German army group center, trapping hundreds of thousands of men and annihilating the Wehrmacht's ability to hold the east. And the timing was no accident. Operation Bagration launched on June 22, the third anniversary of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. A date chosen not for nostalgia but symbolism. The hunter had become the hunted. When the assault came, it was sudden, overwhelming, and meticulously coordinated. German divisions holding key positions like Vitebsk, Orsha, and Bobruisk were struck simultaneously by waves of artillery, tanks, infantry, and air support. And within hours it became clear, they were not facing a push. They were facing a collapse. For the average Soviet soldier, June 1944 was not about glory. It was about revenge and survival. Many had lost entire families in the German invasion. Others had spent years fighting, retreating, then counterattacking through ruin and blood. Their uniforms were simple, supplies often basic. But what they lacked in material they made up for in sheer resolve. As they climbed from the trenches at dawn on June 22, most were silent. Some kissed icons, others held hands. Veterans muttered advice to the younger men. Officers checked their watches. Artillery fire gave them cover, but everyone knew, once you advanced there was no turning back. For hours they ran, crawled, fought through minefields and bunkers. The smell of cordite, blood, and pine filled their lungs. Some were cut down in minutes. Others fought on into the night. For these men the war was not abstract. It was personal. Every village taken was a step closer to home, or what remained of it. They didn't speak of ideology. They spoke of mothers, brothers, burned homes. This was more than duty. This was retribution. Operation Bagration showcased the lethal evolution of Soviet military hardware. By 1944, the Red Army's technological edge had sharpened dramatically. At the heart of the assault was a staggering array of artillery, over 60,000 guns of all calibers. These weren't simply used to soften defenses. They were the main weapon. Preceding the infantry assault, Soviet artillery barrages often lasted over an hour, saturating German positions with explosive force. Precision was improved through better coordination with forward observers and aerial spotting. Then came the Katyusha. Nicknamed Stalin's organ for its shrieking rocket sound, the Katyusha multiple rocket launcher delivered a psychological blow almost as potent as its physical devastation. Entire sectors of the front vanished under salvos. German soldiers who survived the initial barrages often emerged disoriented, deafened, and already surrounded. Tanks like the T-34-85, faster, more mobile, with better armor and a powerful 85mm gun, gave Soviet armored divisions flexibility and lethality. Infantry support weapons had also improved, with better anti-tank rifles, mortars, and machine guns allowing combined arms units to penetrate deep and fast. The Soviet war machine had evolved, and it now moved with terrifying precision. The Red Army's tactical doctrine had matured into something formidable: deep operation. This wasn't about frontal assaults alone. It was about disrupting enemy rear areas, command nodes, logistics hubs, and reserves. Soviet planners aimed not just to breach German lines, but to dismantle their ability to fight. Engineers played a critical role. Bridging rivers under fire, clearing minefields, and building roads across marshland allowed tanks and trucks to maintain tempo. Soviet shock armies would smash the front, then mobile tank groups would rush through the gaps, encircling German units before they could retreat. The coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air power reached a new level. Each Soviet front had overlapping objectives. If one failed, the others would still push forward. And in the summer of 1944, they all succeeded. On the Soviet side, a coalition of hardened commanders and cold, calculated leadership drove Bagration forward. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet war titan, stood at the center of planning. His mind was forged in the fires of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk. Alongside him, Chief of the General Staff Alexander Vasilevsky coordinated the vast machinery of war. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, leading the First Belarusian Front, had been imprisoned and tortured under Stalin's purges, yet now commanded hundreds of thousands with unshakable composure. Even Stalin, who had once micromanaged disaster in 1941, had learned to delegate. He trusted his marshals, gave them strategic freedom, and kept the political machine focused on unity of effort. This mature collaboration between political and military power became a ruthless weapon in itself. In contrast, the German leadership was fractured, reactive, and dangerously blind. Field Marshal Ernst Busch commanded Army Group Center. A loyal soldier but inflexible strategist, Busch repeatedly reported to Hitler that the front was secure. Even when signs of Soviet buildup became impossible to ignore, Busch was denied reinforcements and forbidden to retreat. His hands were tied. Behind him stood Adolf Hitler, a man still obsessed with offense, still believing his will could substitute for strategy. He forbade withdrawals. He demanded stand-fast orders, dooming units to encirclement and destruction. As the Soviet storm advanced, German commanders pleaded for permission to retreat, to reposition, to survive. But orders from the Wolf's Lair were final. The collapse of Army Group Center was not only due to Soviet strength, it was fueled by German miscalculation. Hitler believed the Soviets incapable of large-scale coordinated offensives. His belief in Aryan military superiority remained unshaken, even after Stalingrad and Kursk. When intelligence reports began hinting at Soviet buildups in Belarusia, they were dismissed or downplayed. German logistics were in chaos. Supply lines were overextended, bridges in disrepair, and fuel reserves dwindling. Many divisions were under strength, some down to half their original manpower. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was now a shadow of itself, unable to challenge Soviet air superiority over the battlefield. On top of that, Hitler had ordered a strategic redeployment toward the Western Front. D-Day was expected. Normandy had become a fixation. Hundreds of tanks, aircraft, and elite divisions were sent westward, away from the Eastern Front, under the assumption that the center could hold without them. This left Army Group Center exposed, fragmented, and isolated. Worst of all, Hitler's refusal to allow retreat sealed their fate. As Soviet encirclements closed like iron jaws, entire corps were cut off, surrounded, and eliminated. German attempts to break out were poorly coordinated and often forbidden altogether. What might have been an orderly withdrawal became a rolling disaster. The Wehrmacht, once feared across Europe, was now cracking open under its own weight. As the Red Army rolled through Belarusia, villages and towns long forgotten by the outside world reappeared. What they found was a graveyard. Entire communities had been wiped out. Jewish populations had been eradicated. Civilians who had survived lived under years of brutal occupation, starvation, forced labor, public executions. The scale of destruction defied comprehension. To many Soviet soldiers, liberation brought deep emotion. Tears fell as villagers emerged from cellars, emaciated and trembling. In towns like Polotsk and Baranovichi, survivors embraced their rescuers with disbelief. Priests wept. Children clung to uniforms. But not all was joy. Soviet revenge ran deep. In some cases, captured collaborators were executed on the spot. Houses associated with German supporters were burned. The Red Army did not arrive as pacifists. It arrived as a force of fury. Moreover, the Soviet regime brought its own shadow. Liberation was often followed by rapid re-Sovietization. Political officers reinstated, NKVD files reopened, and former Polish and Belarusian partisans investigated. Still, for millions, the fall of the Nazi grip felt like air returning to lungs. After 3 years of horror, the invaders were finally being driven back. And they would not stop until Berlin. At 5 a.m. on June 22, 1944, the Soviet assault began in earnest. More than 7,000 artillery pieces opened fire in a thunderous barrage that seemed to shake the earth itself. Soviet planes strafed rear positions, destroyed bridges, and disrupted command posts. In less than 90 minutes, the front lines of Army Group Center were in disarray. North of the front, in the Vitebsk-Gorsha sector, the 3rd Belarusian Front under General Ivan Cherniakovsky surged forward. German 3rd Panzer Army, caught off guard, was rapidly encircled. Vitebsk, a key rail hub, fell after just 3 days of fighting. 5 German divisions were trapped. Less than 1,000 men escaped. To the south, the 1st Belarusian Front under Rokossovsky made a bold two-pronged attack on Bobruisk, one through swampy terrain the Germans had deemed impassable. It wasn't. Soviet engineers built roads overnight. Tanks rolled through marshes under cover of artillery. Within 48 hours, German positions were outflanked. By June 26, Bobruisk was under siege. The city, a fortress just days earlier, fell in flames. The German Ninth Army lost over 60,000 men, most killed or captured. In the center, the 2nd Belarusian Front cracked the German line at Mogilev. As Soviet forces poured through the breach, the German Fourth Army began to disintegrate. Everywhere the same pattern unfolded: breakthrough, encirclement, destruction. German command posts went silent. Supply convoys vanished. Units found themselves surrounded without orders, without ammunition, without hope. Entire battalions surrendered en masse, a phenomenon unheard of on the Eastern Front until now. Panicked requests for withdrawal were either ignored or denied. By July 1st, the Soviets had advanced over 150 miles. Army Group Center was no longer retreating. It was ceasing to exist, and Stalin demanded more. The final blow came in early July. The road to Minsk, the capital of Belarusia and linchpin of German defenses, lay open. Soviet forces, pressing forward from 3 directions, aimed to encircle and destroy what remained of Army Group Center. From the north, Cherniakovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front raced along the Minsk-Vilnius highway. From the south, Rokossovsky drove northward. In the center, Zakharov's 2nd Belarusian Front pushed west with relentless force. German resistance stiffened, but it was too little, too late. On July 3, Soviet tanks entered Minsk. Fighting raged in the streets, but by nightfall the swastika no longer flew over the city. What remained of German forces east of Minsk were now trapped. A massive encirclement, later called the Minsk Pocket, closed around more than 100,000 German troops. With no supplies, no air support, and no reinforcements, the German soldiers inside the pocket were bombarded day and night. Soviet artillery pounded the trapped formations. Infantry assaulted from all sides. By July 11, organized resistance ceased. Of the 100,000 encircled troops, less than 10,000 escaped. Most were captured. Many never returned home. In just 3 weeks, the Red Army had advanced nearly 400 kilometers and destroyed the heart of the German Eastern Front. Army Group Center, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was annihilated. The numbers tell a grim story. Operation Bagration inflicted over 450,000 casualties on the German army, including 180,000 killed or missing. Nearly 30 divisions were destroyed. Thousands of tanks, guns, and vehicles were captured or left smoldering in the forests and fields of Belarusia. Entire corps had ceased to exist. High-ranking officers were dead or taken prisoner. For the first time in the war, German generals had begun to doubt not just their Führer, but their ability to recover. The psychological blow was immense. Until now, even in defeat, the Wehrmacht had been seen as capable of counterattack. Now it was on the run. German morale plummeted. Civilians in East Prussia began whispering of Soviet revenge. Hitler, enraged, refused to believe the scale of the disaster, blaming his generals, never himself. Meanwhile, the Soviets had recaptured over 100,000 square kilometers of territory, including all of Belarusia and parts of Lithuania and eastern Poland. Cities like Grodno, Lida, and Baranovichi were now back under Soviet control. The Eastern Front had shifted westward, permanently. The collapse in the east had ripple effects across the entire war. With the Wehrmacht reeling, Hitler had no choice but to shift more troops eastward, stripping the Western Front of reserves just as the Allies surged inland from Normandy. It was a fatal imbalance. German defenses across Europe became overstretched. Coordination broke down. The once mighty German war machine was now fighting a two-front war with a shattered spine. Even among Nazi leadership, the illusion of invincibility shattered. The July 20th plot, an attempted assassination of Hitler by German officers, took place just weeks after Bagration. Though it failed, it reflected a deep shift in confidence. Soviet advances did not stop. By August, they reached the Vistula River, the last natural barrier before Warsaw. The front lines were now less than 300 miles from Berlin. The question was no longer whether Nazi Germany would lose. It was when. Operation Bagration is often overshadowed by the Western Allied landings in Normandy, which began just 16 days earlier. But in scale, scope, and consequence, Bagration dwarfed D-Day. While the beaches of France saw 150,000 Allied troops landed on June 6, the Red Army launched over 2 million men into a single coordinated offensive. It resulted in the largest defeat in German military history, far surpassing even Stalingrad. Yet Western history often overlooks it. Perhaps because it was Soviet. Perhaps because it was brutal. But Operation Bagration stands as the moment the Third Reich truly began to die. It wasn't a single battle. It was a chain reaction, a sweeping erasure of German control from the heart of Eastern Europe. It showed the world that the Red Army was not just surviving. It was winning. June 22, 1941. Germany invades the Soviet Union. June 22, 1944. The Soviet Union begins the destruction of Nazi Germany. 3 years to the day. A historical mirror. What began with a German advance into Russia ended with a Soviet advance toward Berlin. In that symmetry lies one of history's most brutal truths. Empires fall fastest from the center. And on that summer morning in 1944, the center finally collapsed.